Hi, Gil.
Hi, how are you?
Hey, thanks.
I said I'll go a little bit earlier to make sure it's working.
Yes, that's a good idea. I hope Gur will also log on.
Yeah, no problem. How's things going?
Things are going really well.
Yeah.
Having a lot of activity. We've never had so many live streaming events at a single conference.
Well,
It's just about every hour we have an innovators pitch challenge or one of our investor panels or a workshop panel like this one. And people are loving it.
good. Our focus on this, the cross-border transaction, and I connected with Gura. I sent him a bunch of things that we will talk about before. It was
Great.
focused on investment. Our focus obviously is on investment, cross-border transactions. That's what we're going to focus.
I'm looking forward to learning something myself.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope I learned something too.
No, it's something that we try to encourage companies to reach out to international investors at Resi through Resi and through our database, and we think it's a great opportunity, especially for companies that are in countries that don't have a lot of capital available. You have to go international.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. How long have you been in Boston, Gil?
Oh, many years. Just my accent never changed, but I've been here since when did I really moved here in 95. I've been here before, but 95 is when I really moved.
95. Okay, yeah, it's been a few years.
Yeah, 95. How many years is it now? 20, no, more.
26?
26, 26 or so. Yeah.
Yeah, my case is kind of similar to yours. I also was an expat. I moved to Spain in 86.
Oh, nice.
And I've been living in Spain all this time, except for the last 6 years that I was living in Boston.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm.
What brought you to Spain?
Study program.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and I ended up meeting my wife that year. And
you see, my wife came to an overseas program in Tel Aviv University and got me here. So I had the feeling it has a similar story.
Yep, similar story.
You never know.
So it's still a little early, but Gur, he got the calendar invite and he acknowledged it, so he should be good to go.
He will be up soon. Yeah, he's very nice. It's funny. I worked a bit with. I didn't connect at the beginning. It's fun with some of the investments I was involved with recently. There's some people from his fund, some of his partners like Nacht and other Marius Nacht invested, but not through the fund. In a couple of companies I'm involved with. So
it's too bad that this company from San Francisco couldn't join.
It's okay. We will manage.
No, I know you will.
Yeah. No, it wouldn't hurt to have another entrepreneur, but that's okay. He also has a lot of gore, with working with all his portfolio. He would have a lot of insight. That's cool.
The A-Moon Fund, they have a really interesting newsletter. It's really a very active fund, isn't it?
Yeah, they're very active. There's a bunch of them out there that are quite active in the space, so it's nice to see.
Yeah.
Before the call, I read some numbers from there, and I think in Israel in general, they raised more money so far from VC this year than the entire last year, which is already a record. So there's a lot of activity. Also here, there's a lot of activity. There's a lot of money, but some of the rounds are really big.
There is so much money. It's crazy. Yeah.
Not everybody can get to it, but there is a lot of, for those who can, there are a lot of good options.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's still not for everyone. Not everybody can access it.
I was reading that 2020 was actually a record year for life science investment.
What was the number?
And that's it's hard to believe. I'll
What was
send
your number? Yeah.
I made some slides for a presentation.
Oh, excellent.
I'll send those to you.
Numbers regarding the global VC investment that I pulled for this call from KPMG, and that was a record too. They had 300, well, not record, almost record, but it was only second to 2018 record, but it was 300 billion.
Wow, 300 billion.
Hi, it's Gur.
Hi, Gur. How are you?
Good, thank you. I'll be joining more formally in a couple of minutes. Just let you know I'm actually here.
Great.
Okay. Let me see if I can find those numbers.
Yeah. I didn't pull up specifically for life science. I just pulled the global one just to show people a sense about how much activity there is.
Yep. I think these were global numbers, the ones that I had.
Numbers are big. Some background noise.
Yeah. Can't find it. Well, when I find it, I'll send it to you. I think it's just interesting.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, we have some attendees coming on. So we'll be starting in just a few minutes. We still have people logging on. Okay, hello Vera, we can see you now. So welcome to today's webinar on navigating cross-border investments. This is a new workshop at Resi, and it's sponsored by the Boston law firm Burns and Levinson, and we're very happy to be offering this new content at the conference because we think it's such a relevant topic. Today we have from Burns and Levinson, Gil Breeman, who is working out of the Boston office. And we have on the investment side, Gur Rashwald, who is with Amun Fund in Israel, a very interesting investment firm that I'm sure he'll tell us a little bit more about. So I'll hand the mic over to you, Gil, and thanks for being here.
Yes, hi. Thank you very much, Greg, and I'm happy to be on this call. As we go through this call, if anyone has any questions, Greg will help us to identify those, and we will be happy to respond and make it as interactive as possible so everybody can enjoy it. And of course, thank you, Gor, for being here. And together we will have a conversation, discussion about a variety of topics to help our audience and everybody learn more about navigating cross-border transactions, in particular in the investment context. Just to give some numbers before we start our discussion about the size and opportunities in this market, those are some numbers that we pulled out from KPMG. It's in 2020, the annual global VC investment was about $300.5 billion, of which a little bit more than half was done in the US, 156 billion in 2020. But there are plenty of activity, as you can see, outside the United States. Europe had a record year with about 49 billion in investments. Asia has been very active. In fact, in Q4, they had approximately five deals of over 1 billion just in China itself. So the activity is definitely global. It is also continuing very strongly in 2021 so far. There is a lot of dry powder, as we say, in the market, still low interest rate in many countries around the world, and there is a continuing digital transformation and lots of opportunities for investment around the globe. So we expect this phenomena to continue and exist and probably increase. So the first point that we want to discuss, it's obviously why should the cross-border investors look for deals outside their home countries? And I'll turn to you, Gil, to start.
Thank you, Gil. First of all, thank you very much for having me. And Greg, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Let me start out by giving a little bit of an introduction because I do think it's actually helpful to answering the question. So first of all, a little bit about Amun. Amun is Israel's largest healthcare venture fund. We started out originally as the family office of Marius Nacht. Marius is one of the co-founders of Checkpoint Software, the originators of the firewall, a phenomenal entrepreneur. And people were interested in what he was doing. Our first pool of capital was his family money. And he was investing in both early and late stage healthcare companies. The concept, the thesis behind his original entree into the field was that he has a great background in technology. And our co-founder and managing partner, Yair Shindel, comes from the medical side. He's a medical doctor, originally from Israel, went to HBS for business school, was an entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur many times, and they came back together to start this fund. And what they were really looking for was the convergence between healthcare and technology and how that's really transforming. And we see it as a phenomenally transformational moment in healthcare right now, akin to, if you will, the same transformation in healthcare when Ignaz Semmelweis had doctors wash their hands between women giving birth, okay? And that changed the postpartum death rate from like 20% to 2%, okay? Or when Ian Fleming gave penicillin in 1928 to the first person in St. Mary's Hospital in London. It's that sort of transformational moment in healthcare that we believe is going on right now. We invest out of two funds. One is a 750 million late stage fund, mid to late stage fund, across healthcare, digital devices, drugs, diagnostics, and a little S for services. And we also invest out of an early seed stage fund. It's a $115 million fund in seed and mostly seed and A rounds. And we invest globally. Now just 2 seconds on personal background, and then I'm going to answer the question about why invest globally. Okay, so forgive me for just a second. Originally from New York, trained in internal medicine in New York at the hospital in Mount Sinai. I was chief resident there in 97, 98, went into private practice, eventually got my MBA and went over to Piper Jaffray as a sell-side equity analyst, as a senior publishing on specialty pharmaceuticals. And then I went over to Venrock as an investor in their public healthcare equities fund for 5 years. And then I ran a couple of biotech companies. I moved to Israel 2 years ago and I joined Amoon, and I am a partner in the late stage fund. All that aside, okay.
And you have a beautiful view behind you.
Thank you. Yes, it's a little virtual view, but that for anybody who cares is Tel Aviv. So why invest outside of your home ground? Okay, and I'll tell you there are really 3 reasons. The first is data. So we're a very data-driven fund, and the data clearly indicates that your best investments really predicated on 2 factors. Number 1 is personal connection. Okay, people do better investments when there's a personal connection there, for whatever set of reasons, right? In other words, I'm not saying that we don't take a cold call. We always take the cold call. We will always look. We're happy to look at investments. And anybody who wants to send us anything, you can send it to me at gur, G-U-R, at amoon.fund, F-U-N-D. That aside, your best investments come when there's a connection, okay? And Amoon actually has 2 meanings. For those who speak Hebrew, we mean emun as in trust. Okay, the most important thing between an entrepreneur and a VC is the relationship of trust. It underlies everything we do. And the second thing is we look for moonshots. You know, we're really looking for the cures. And that's something that I think this convergence of healthcare technology is really bringing about. And I'll tell you, I was a physician in private practice 20 odd years ago, and we weren't curing much then outside of the penicillin from Ian Fleming. But we're getting closer now with gene therapy and stuff like that. So the first thing is the data demonstrates that relationships make good investments. The second thing, actually some VC's best investment returns come from when they don't invest in their own backyard. And the reason is because when you're investing in your own backyard, you're competing with other funds that have the same sort of, it's a level playing field with other funds in your own backyard, okay? They know the same players, they know the same things that are going on. And what tends to happen is you tend to have higher valuations. Valuations start to creep up because you're competing amongst your peers. When you compete outside of your peer set, you tend to make better deals. So that's the first thing, okay? Why a global investor? Because we help make bridges. There is a tremendous amount of phenomenal science in Europe and especially in Israel, okay? And one of the interesting things about Israel and Europe is that it's somewhat easy to get the well, easy is a relative term, but to get the friends and family round, the first $1 or $2 million. In Israel, for example, the government is very supportive of startups. The Israeli Innovations Authority is very much willing to give out grants with very few strings tied, and companies can get started up. But what they're missing is a capital infrastructure to help grow them after the initial round, after that early seed and A round. And they either sell out early or they die off on the vine. And so to be a global investor is to help those companies that are truly diamonds in the rough get through that, what we refer to as the valley of death, okay? And there are a tremendous number of opportunities in Israel and Europe. In the United States too, don't get me wrong, but there's much more competition in the United States amongst funds. And we joke about valuation, right? That the valuation for the Israeli company, the American company is the same. The difference is the prices in shekels. Okay, so it's, you know, at least a third of what the American valuations are. And I'm actually living through a good example of that right now in an investment that I'm hopefully closing tomorrow, where honestly the valuation is 1/3 of what it would have been in the United States, the same data, phenomenal management team, et cetera. So I think the reasons to invest globally are that you can find these diamonds in the rough, you can make a difference, and you can get better deals, and therefore hopefully generate better returns. And you know, have a discussion about that.
Yep. Yes, no, absolutely right. And some of the other criteria is obviously from diversification, purely from diversification, having a portfolio that it's also in different areas and different risks has been some of the additional things that people look. Also, access to talent and other relationships has been.
Gil, you're 100% correct, by the way. If I'm sorry to interrupt, but the comment about access to talent is really key. So one of the things we think about as an investor is how do we differentiate ourselves, right? You know, for phenomenal companies that have easy access to capital, right? Why do they come to Amoon, right? They can just go to, you know, I'm not going to name my competitors, but everybody knows who they are, okay? There are a lot of great funds out there. Why do you need my money, right? Why am I going to get into the deal? But what we have found, to Gil's very important point, we actually have a group called Amoon Alpha. So not only do we have investors, but we have actually dedicated personnel. We're about a 60-person fund at the moment. A good 10 of those personnel are dedicated to portfolio success. And one of those is really talent, okay, is just dedicated group that works on finding talent for our companies. This year alone, we've placed something like, we have about 45 portfolio companies at the moment, give or take 42, I think. And we've placed something like 8 or 9 CEOs and board members, or C-levels and board members through our talent network. Talent is key to a good company. And to your point about other types of talent, there's also talent on the scientific side. I think that global investors very much help companies create a bridge. Okay, and a bridge is really a two-way street. Excuse the metaphor. Yes, you know, for the local side, for a European and Israeli company, we help open up the American market or introduce them to American funds. We bridge that way. But on the reverse side, for example, for a couple of American investments we've made, one of the things we've been successful in doing is opening up, you know, what's going on in Israel on the scientific side. For example, we have a stealth genomics company, and the ability to access some of the scientific key opinion leaders here in Israel was really key to some of the work the company was doing and help them succeed. And companies really need to know what's going on a global basis. One of the hardest things to keep a track of is the competitive landscape, right? What's happening? You don't know what's happening in some lab somewhere that you just never heard of. And so having a more global reach, having an investor that has, you know, feet on the ground in several different places really helps you access a better network of information, of business intelligence.
Oh, that's absolutely right. And that places, you know, a fund like yours is a very unique fund that looks at things much broader, you know, than just looking at what's in your backyard. That helps a lot. Also, I've seen, and maybe you can say a few words about it, also I've seen that companies that take advantage of it, you know, through the investor network gets, you know, some of the early testing and the clinical side, as you said, in certain jurisdictions. I know some people use places in Africa, in India, in other places where they can actually, from regulatory perspective, sometimes can do some initial checks at a much more attractive prices and visibility stuff than going to the most expensive places in the world by using
Yeah,
them.
no, it's an interesting double-edged sword there, by the way. You're absolutely right, Gil. There are certain places, Australia, for example, you know, has a mechanism where like 50% of the R&D money comes back to the company. So that can be very good if you're cash strapped, and they are more willing to open up the world to phase 1 trials. So that's a good example. The double-edged sword there, though, is, you know, when you're going for that next round of capital and people want to know how good was the data, how real was it, right? You want to know that data was done in a credible manner.
That's right.
And that is something, to your point, though, that a good VC can help with, right? Because it doesn't necessarily have to be done in the United States. And sometimes actually some of these trials can't be done in the United States, you know, for ethical reasons. You know, certain treatments already exist. I'll give you an example, actually, of a portfolio company. We have a portfolio company that has a once monthly injection for Copaxone, which is a drug for multiple sclerosis. Okay, now there is a daily and now weekly version. And if you want to run a head-to-head trial versus the weekly version, it's a little bit hard to do that in the United States. Okay, but you can go to other jurisdictions where Copaxone is not available at all. And it's ethically quite normal to basically say, listen, you can't get the treatment, but we'll give you one of either treatment. Okay, so you're getting either standard of care or what's potentially better, but normally you wouldn't have anything. So there, it's ethically possible to do that study. So it is actually very important, the point you raised.
Absolutely. And transitioning into it is obviously the one of the I find it the interesting thing, and also a strength eventually is the cultural differences that you get when you have. It presents at times obviously challenges as well, and this is to me the most important, actually intangible challenge that you have in cross-border investments, where you have teams at different places, investors at different places, but interact with between investor and company, investor and investor, and different dynamics that we will talk about. But it's the cultural aspect of it. I would say that from a legal perspective and a technical perspective, we can find the solution, to most problems that come with those, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. But from a cultural perspective, there got to be a fit and understanding and respect. Can you elaborate a little bit also from your experience how the culture plays into it?
Absolutely, Gil. It is an extremely important point that I think people can miss in ways that are unexpected. So first of all, you're 100% correct. Sometimes there are glaring examples, and hopefully I'm not making any faux pas when I give some examples. Okay, let me start out by saying that if I offend anybody in advance, I apologize. Okay. There are different cultures. There's some cultures where they don't like to say no. Okay. And so you think you're having a negotiation and everybody's nodding their head yes, and you don't realize that what they're really saying is they're nodding their head no.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's yes, I hear you, I call it. They said, yes, I hear
right,
you.
Yes, I hear you, but no, we're never going to do this.
Yeah. Yes.
Or, you don't recognize that you're negotiating with a junior person and not the decision maker. Okay. Sometimes the decision maker, isn't going to show up until the very end, and everything can change at the last minute. It's important, first of all, to sort of get a good grounding in the culture that you're going to be dealing with from a very large point of view. That, by the way, is true for culture, but not only for culture, for the groups you're dealing with. When you're trying to raise money as a entrepreneur, you need to know who you're sitting across the table from. Forget just culturally, but what is their strategy for investment, right? Because you want to shape your story to the strategy, because if it doesn't fit the strategy, they're not going to do the investment, even if it's a wonderful investment. Okay. So in many ways, it's the same issue. You've got to know who you're sitting across from. And on the cultural level, I think where people make the biggest mistakes is when they think they're close to the culture. Okay. And you'd be surprised sometimes how far people are from the culture. So, on the Israeli side, for example, many Israelis speak English. They speak English quite well. Okay. And they live in a quasi-European culture. Okay. And they think that that's close to the American culture, but Americans are not like that at all. So my mother's Israeli. I grew up in New York. I was born in New York and grew up in New York. And I'm going to tell you that for a reason. I am very much a New Yorker. Okay. I have an American sense of culture. And I used to come to Israel. I'd visit my cousins. And the first thing they tell me when I get off the plane is, Gur, you look fat. Okay. I had a weight problem growing up. That's great for Israel. You can be blunt and forward. You love me and you'll tell me what you think. And that's wonderful in some places. That does not work in the United States. Okay. Frankly, I don't know if I want to know what you think. Okay. So, you have to be very sensitive to the cultural differences, especially when you're next to the culture. Okay. And I'll tell you the biggest mistake a big mistake people make is translation. Okay. Because again, you think you know the language, but what you don't know, okay, are the sayings. Okay, and I'll give you an example. There's a saying in Hebrew, a waste of time. Okay, chaval al hazman, for those of you who speak Hebrew. What that means in Hebrew is it's a waste of time, but the connotation means it's a great thing. Okay, it's not really a waste of time. Okay, it's a wonderful thing that happened. Okay, and I know somebody that I was standing next to who went on a company tour. They took us all around the tour. And they got to the end of it, and the CEO asked, "How was it?" And the guy said, "It's a waste of time." Okay, which he meant in a good way, but he translated from the Hebrew into the English, and it doesn't work. Okay, so especially when you do translation, stick to what you really know what the words mean. So on cultural issues, you also have to be aware of where cultures are sensitive in certain areas. Again, to use an example closer to home, a lot of times you'll get people here in Israel who say, it's not a problem, I'll take care of it. Okay, what they mean is we recognize it's a problem, but we're going to bull our way through and eventually we'll figure it out. In America, they'd much rather, or at least from a VC point of view, I don't think it's just American, I think it's European American VCs and ourselves too, is just acknowledge the risk. We'll decide as investors if we want to take the risk or not, but just acknowledge that you recognize that there's a risk. Maybe the mitigants we could talk about. So you really have to be sensitive to the cultural and the investor point of view, because I think investing in some ways is its own culture. I'll stop there. I'm happy to take questions, comments, or hear your side of it, Gil, in your experience.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Everything is on point. I wouldn't say waste of your time as far as what you said, but no, everything is absolutely on point. And I found, culture, once you acknowledge it and use it, it's a strength for a company. And we obviously living in times now where the importance of diversity and of the team and the group is rightfully heightened, and it adds great strengths to a company. So, and it's not by chance that a lot of companies that succeeded also in the US were started by entrepreneurs who immigrated from other places or came from other places. So the strengths in culture and different viewpoints, it's definitely important. That being said, sitting on board, taking investments, and seeing sometimes the even unintentional bias to where you are or where the group is from and the way they communicate with each other when other people are there, it's something that everybody needs to pay attention to. So definitely I would recommend everybody, look globally, but do your homework, respect other people's way of doing things, and make sure that it fits with the way you want to do things. And if it does, it can benefit everyone.
I'll tell you the two things I'd love to add, though. The first thing is, in something you just raised, that sometimes there are cultural biases, there are blindnesses, and sometimes people from other countries who come to, specifically, let's say America, right? You come as an entrepreneur, you're in America and you decide to be an entrepreneur. And sometimes that's an advantage because you don't have the cultural bias that something can't be done, right? And sometimes a lot of people won't do it because they think can't do it, can't fix it, don't want to deal with the problem. And, you just don't know that you're being stubborn and fighting against a brick wall. But if you can break through that brick wall, you can make a tremendous difference. So sometimes it's a big advantage. Yes,
no, absolutely. Some questions that often come in those cross-border transactions that I have to face many times, and I'm sure you do, and the answer is not necessarily one, but where should the parent company, right? So, we're ready to invest, and then we have a company that is based outside the US. And then these questions comes a lot with US investors, but I assume with other investors as well. Where should the so-called the parent company be, and what are some of the considerations that involve? You talk about, in certain places we have issues like government fundings that may restrict those decisions. There could be restrictions on transfer of IP. There may be a legitimate reason to keep the group where it is. There's not always reason to move it, and many times there is reason not to move it as far as talent. It could be tax considerations. There could be a variety of issues that you would look at, but to us, and I will let you more, it's always like the question is, where is your market really? Well, where are you trying to commercialize, and where is likely going to be your next round and exits, and how do you make it comfortable for your next investors or buyer to go about it? And sometimes the answers is Delaware, like many investments are, and we may have to go through some internal reorg, and again, it depends what stage is the company, what restrictions we have. But there have been enough scenarios, and it's from Israel as well, that it stays the parent is not always in the US, and sometimes just the commercial office, the commercial operation stays, and maybe later on it grows. So I'm just interested in your input because it's something that comes up often.
Yeah, so Gil, I may be more interested in your input on this one. I'm certainly going to give you mine, but I think you're going to have to step out of your hat as moderator and give us a legal opinion here. So let me start out by saying you've raised a tremendously interesting question, one that we struggle with a lot. And sometimes you have to be careful, to use an American phrase, you don't let the tail wag the dog, okay? I think you have to think long-term for the vision of the company. The first place is start out long-term for the vision of the company. Where do you want to be? And to your point, who is your real market? Okay. And it's okay for the company to grow locally, but at some point, you're going to have to recognize, and I think that this is true, for example, in many digital companies, because in many digital companies, the market, and it's true for a lot of companies, don't get me wrong, the market's the US, okay? That's where the payers are. And, you know, there's a bit of a joke about that. I'm blanking on the name of the guy, but he was a famous bank robber. They asked him, why do you rob banks? And his answer is because that's where the money is, okay? So you go where your market is, you go where the money is. Okay. And so it's okay to start up the company locally, but if you recognize that your market is somewhere else, okay, you should build the initial structure of the company with that in mind from a legal and a taxation point of view. Because at some point, if you want to change it, it can become exceedingly expensive or difficult, or you're gonna turn into some tax hassle that you didn't know you had. You really got to think about it in advance. And that's true, by the way, also for the IP, right? When you're initially starting up the company and you say to yourself, you know, I'm going to be clever with the IP. I'm going to put it in some tax haven or something. Think long-term, what's going to happen to that company and structure from that point of view. And I would add that you want to make sure that the lawyer who's helping you has access to needed to international own turf, their own area. But if you have a vision that's longer term, that's a little broader, make sure you know that they're thinking about that, and the lawyer that you're dealing with is really willing to ask and look into those issues and think about it. In the end, I will tell you, we're often biased and have a Delaware company somewhere in the mix for various reasons. But you know, that's how we try and look at it. I'd love to get your viewpoint on this, Gil.
Sure. Yeah, I know. So my experience and with the most successful exits that I've been involved with, the TED operation, you know, globally, we often, I'm thinking, but in all of them, we had with a Delaware parent because we knew that the market is in the US. We wanted to facilitate. We looked long term. Where are the likely next rounds? What will be easier for our potential acquirers? You know, and when we figure out that those activities are likely to happen in the US, we wanted to put together a structure that, you know, facilitate this, you know, over the long term, you know, and when you make those decisions earlier, as you say, it's much easier, both from a tax perspective and whatever exposure perspective. If we need to flip, we flip it early. They really know there's not much yet in the company that it creates a real problem. So in all of those successful situations that I've been involved with, we actually ended up with a Delaware parent because we knew that the market will be, essentially, we want to sell to the US and we want to probably exit in the US. That was the highest likelihood, and those things really translated. So I'm happy to step in and say it, and it's not because we're here. We had, you know, obviously situations where it was a little bit more problematic, but one of the cautionary things that, you know, that I've heard in those situations, and I want to take it out, some people say, I hear it, you know, the undertone that it may, you know, I want to establish something in my home country and it's not really patriotic for me to have a parent somewhere else, as if they did something wrong to their, you know, to their country, or something wrong to their belief. And I think, you know, the lesson many times for that if you build a great business, you will help your country, you'll help your talent pool, you'll help your surrounding, and it doesn't really matter where the parent sits. What you want to think about is what will be best for your business, you know, and it's okay to have an R&D group in a certain location that is not where the parent is located, and all those other things, and you can, you know, you can put your talent where it needs to be, but for purposes of fundraising and exit, make it easier for your targets to do the due diligence the way they used to, and do all those other things that, so often when your target market is the US, I would, you know, we're probably going to end up with having a Delaware parent just to facilitate the process.
Yeah, I'd also add to that, by the way, try not to get too clever. And I'll give you examples of that. There's a company we invested in Europe that they have a platform. So from their point of view, with the platform, they want to spin out baby companies. Okay, so they created platform company A, and they had baby company B and baby company C and baby company D. Okay. And at this point, it's relatively early in the life of the company, and there's really nothing in B, C, and D other than some paperwork. And yet when we have to hire lawyers to do the legal due diligence on the company, they end up charging us not just for looking at the parent company A, but for also looking at all the work of B, C, and D, which at this point have nothing in them. Okay. And, you know, it's great if you want to spin out a company later, but if you're going to do it, wait till you're there. Don't
Right.
You know, get clever in advance. That's all I'll say.
Very, 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 very true. You know, sometimes companies that are not ready even to have a spin-off, they have some idea, or they think, oh, let's call, you know, why don't we put this in something separate? And you always have to be respectful for your investor who wants the entire pie, and don't try to slice and dice or do some funny stuff. It gets you really nowhere. And absolutely.
So we have a question on the side here.
Okay.
Let me just read it out. Hi, okay. We have an AI-based integrated platform technology for precision medicine and cancer. We have developed and validated, looking for 5 million Series A funding for clinical evaluation and market launch. We are based in India. Do you think we should set up our company in the USA to get the funding? So again, I'm going to let Gil comment on the legal side. I think if you have a US Delaware company, it's going to make things a lot easier. And by the way, when you set up that company, don't set it up as an LLC. Because guarantee you at some point you're going to have to change it to a corporate C. Yeah. Okay. So do yourself a favor, just forget the LLC structure. Causes problems.
Sure.
You think you should have a Delaware corporation? It's not that much to do it. And from a pure legal structure, like financing point of view, it does make things a little bit easier. Not so much from a fundraising point of view. Okay. Purely from a fundraising point of view, you know, I don't sit there and think, you know, it's a Delaware company versus a, you know, London company or whatever it is. I mean, sometimes there's some tax implications, and I will tell you, oddly enough, depending on who's investing, sometimes there are reporting implications. Okay. So you have to be, sometimes it's a problem for investors, certain jurisdictions of the way things are, because, you know, RLPs always want to have some element of, you know, don't report, don't say what I do, this, that, whatever it is. And sometimes there are reporting requirements. So be careful from that point of view. So often USA is just easier. But I don't think you need to be a US company in order to raise US funds. I do think long-term, it's better to have a US parent just to make things simpler. Again, I turn it over to you, Gil.
Yeah, no, I agree. And there is the period also between the, you know, when you're looking for funds, when you're seeking funds, and you make it known to your target. If your target VCs are really US VCs, and right now you're based in India, it's okay to say, you know, as part of the financing, I'm looking to, you know, to set up a parent to facilitate the process and putting it in the US. You don't have to do it necessarily while you're seeking the funds. It can be done in conjunction with it. The only thing I would recommend, that whichever jurisdiction you're from, just check what's involved in actually doing the you know, in becoming a parent company. In some jurisdictions, there may be some special tax ruling that require to transition certain things, like, you know, not just your shares of your existing shareholders, but there's special things that can happen with your equity plans, the way that, you know, you may need to register your option plan in a certain way in a certain country. It can be different. So, you know, just know the timeline of those things, how long it can take, and all those things, because that can alleviate some anxiety from the prospective investor that is not that familiar with your jurisdiction. And having this done in advance and presenting it in a way that really can let the investor say that this process, you know how to convert, how to go through it, what's the projected timeline, and what, if anything, can go wrong, and why it's wrong. In your case, will give them comfort level.
I'd actually add something that Gil said that's important, because typically we'll give somebody a term sheet, we'll say 30, 45, 60 days to closing, whatever it is. If there's some legal structure that has to be put up and dealt with, and to your point about ESOPs and all that, I guarantee you 30 days is never going to happen. Okay, so be aware that if you have certain legal things that need to get taken care of, it lengthens the process, and just accept it. It's not going to be a big deal, but just accept it. We have another question here. LLCs are not recognized under the Canadian tax system, and so there's a risk of double taxation. how is the best way to avoid this if we are investing in a U.S. company from Canada?
Don't do any
What I would
else.
tell you is have the LLC convert into a C Corp, okay, as prior to the investment. They can do that, okay? You can force them to convert. Not that there won't be some issues, but you don't have to invest in the LLC. Just tell, and we did it recently, actually. For example, I had a company that was an LLC in San Diego, okay? Companies in San Diego, the LLC was not in San Diego. But it was basically an LLC, and as part of the deal, they had to convert into a C Corp. And yes, there were some issues for the company itself and for the current shareholders. But frankly, if I'm going to invest and I need it to be the way I need it to be, they're gonna take my money. They're gonna acquiesce to that.
Yeah, and I'm familiar actually very much with the Canadian issues with LLCs, and typically, it's a problem. It's not a tax efficient way for a Canadian to invest in the US. In addition, it's very important that one of the big reasons why in the US also the C Corp is the right tool for investment, especially venture investment and what have you. There are different reasons. One of them is also the qualified small business stock tax that is currently still available. We will see what will happen, but that allows investors in a company with less than about $50 million in assets to, at the time of investment, to have an exclusion at the exit of the greater of 10 million or 10 times their investment amount. So that's a significant exclusion that applies to investors in a C Corp. So it's beneficial, but yeah, the LLC for Canadians, it's not the most efficient way. Again, if it's the best investment, you just pay more taxes, but it's not an efficient tool.
Yeah, and I try not to let the taxes wag the dog. The other thing I'll tell you is that when you do convert from an LLC to a C Corp or whatever it is, in an early company, it's not such a big deal, okay? Because there just aren't that many assets. But if you have a 400-person company or some large company that you're suddenly converting from an LLC to a C Corp, the amount of legal extra work that you just created is a tremendous amount. So do it early. Don't wait till you're a big company and have to do it, because then you have to account for all the assets and where they are and all the computers you're transferring and all the software licenses you're transferring and all the other stuff, right? And it just becomes a headache.
Very true. Let's talk a little bit about the due diligence that you go through when you conduct some due diligence on cross-border stuff. Is there anything we touched on some of those things before, but anything in particular that you like people to prepare in advance or that you're looking for?
So I'll say a few things on the topic. First of all, we often like to have somebody with boots on the ground in the area, right? So if we're outside of Israel, US, London, and parts of Europe, we will often look for a local VC to partner with, because they will often know things that we just don't know, okay? And we do very, very deep diligence. I'm in the healthcare field, so I will tell you, for those of you who know what the words means, you'll get both a colonoscopy and an endoscopy from us, okay? We look deep. We want to know what's going on the inside, and we will hire local counsel, okay? It's very important, because again, there are always issues you don't know about, things you don't know to ask, how to look things up. In the diligence process, the first thing I'll tell you is it's exceedingly helpful if you have a data room in place, okay? And what I'd recommend you do in order to populate the data room is ask your counsel for their due diligence request list. In other words, if you were going to acquire another company or be acquired by another company, you will get a due diligence checklist from a lawyer, okay? It's a many-page document, and it's a pain, and you need to do it, okay? So you might as well do it in advance and use that checklist to populate your data room at the, okay? Want to see all your toxicology reports. I'm going to want to see your investigator's brochure. I'm going to want to see all the I&D materials, the briefing booklet, the FDA materials, the letters, the back and forth, you name it. I want to see it. And I don't want your summary of it. I want the actual original document. okay? It can be copied. I don't care about that, but I want the actual original document, okay? It's important. I need to know that it says in the top of your studies that this was done in a GLP format, okay? That we follow GCP. All the stuff is exceedingly important. I want to see all your deviation reports, okay? When it comes to manufacturing, I will have a discussion with your QA person or your QP person if you're in Europe, okay? If you really want to know what's going on in a company, go ask the QA. They'll tell you. Okay, I will actually ask to see all the documents. I will read all the documents. Okay, so that's on the therapeutic side. If you're a digital company, we're going to look at other stuff. Not that it's not all that different, but you're not going to necessarily have an investigator's brochure, for example, for a digital company. But I'm going to want to see all the proposals, the RFPs, the contracts, the pilots. If there's patient data, I want to see the patient reports. I would actually tell you that we will ask if you have a trial. I'm a therapeutics guy, which is why I'm focusing on therapeutics. I will ask you for all the patient-related data, okay? Case by case by case, if necessary, all the raw data from your studies, because I will run separate analyses. I will do that work, okay? So it will be a very deep diligence. Don't take it personally. We do it for everybody, okay? The other thing that I would say about diligence in general, there's some of my colleagues, I don't have this bias, but some of my colleagues like to get written responses. Okay. So I will tell you as good practice, if you get questions, not only is it good to have a phone call, what I recommend you do is suggest to the investor, why don't we have a phone call? Okay, XYZ, let's set up a phone call, happy to answer it. And then in advance of the phone call, give them a set of written answers. Okay. It'll help guide the discussion. It'll make them feel comfortable. Some people like it because they had it in writing. Okay. The other thing that's exceedingly important are your lab notebooks. Okay. We'll ask to go through your lab notebooks if you're an early stage company. And believe it or not, we want to see all your board stuff. Okay. We want to, not just the board resolutions. Okay. They're nice. I actually want to see the board package that you put together and hand it out to the board. Okay. So just remember, whenever you're putting together a board package, investors are going to look at it. Okay. Not just the board. So think about the messages you're sharing when you make those board packets. So let me stop there and turn it back over to Gil. I'd love to get his thoughts on this too.
Yeah, that's why we always tell when people put board minutes not to write a story because it's always going to be subject to diligence. So think about what you're putting in there and how you present yourself. No, I completely agree. Some of the other stuff that recently, at least in the US, you have this CFIUS. Sometimes you have to consider certain in a cross-border situation. You have to check, if there's any issues with respect to the origin of the investors, whether you're bringing sometimes a corporate investor from certain jurisdictions that can raise questions for the investment itself, whether it's right or wrong. It's a separate political question, but there are certain situations, especially in the US, it's a big deal right now that there's a lot of discussion around CFIUS, which is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the US, that received a greater authority over the last few years to look into what they call critical technology that can impact a wide range of technologies, where the interagency committee can advise the US president and take some actions when they feel that certain technology goes to the wrong hand through investment in US companies, and they may look at certain jurisdiction and certain technology and create certain issues. Also, as part of due diligence, not in a negative thing, but as you said, also in Israel, other places, there are companies that fund themselves initially through government funding. In some countries, it's very streamlined and they don't ask for too much and they don't place a lot of restrictions. In some countries, when those funds are involved, you have to check what you can and cannot do. As far as flexibility in transitioning certain things. But yeah, other than that, everything make you just mentioned something. We talked earlier about the valuation, obviously, that can be attractive in doing cross-border investment, and I look at the time and we may jump through some of our other things. But as far as the board, you mentioned the board and board composition both in local and cross-border, right? Typically, once we get the investor, we get a more so-called professional board. We will have investor representation, we'll have industry representation, we will have some, probably the CEO represented, and maybe one member from the original group. So typically we'll go through 5, maybe in some cases 7, but hopefully not more than 5 board members with balance to professionalism and independence eventually. In a global company that you had a syndicate of investments, that come from, not just one jurisdiction and things like this. Have you had any special problem with board compositions or interaction with board, or do you find?
Well, I wouldn't call them problems, but I will tell you that there's some
Yeah.
evolution in boards going on. Right? Like California, for example, you have to have there's a diversity requirement, and it's become a real issue because in the end of the day, bowing to the facts of reality, it's becoming harder to find women, for example, with sufficient industry experience. Not that it doesn't exist, okay, but it's a smaller pool. And if you have to have 3 women on the board, for example, it can become difficult. And it's something you have to think about in advance. The diversity requirements are an interesting new issue that we're dealing with. And then sometimes there are local issues. I'll give you an example in London, okay? Companies are required to provide Her Majesty with the local accounts once a year, okay, by a certain date, I forget what it is. And if you don't, there is both a criminal and a civil liability, okay? So, I'm not really interested in having criminal liability, all right? So you just got to be aware of certain things and you really need to understand responsibility. The other thing that I think is exceedingly difficult to deal with right now, but is very important, is D&O insurance, directors and officers insurance. Especially for cross-border investments, the price just keeps going up. It's a significant drain on capital, but you absolutely have to have it with a sufficient tail. And just think about it. Those are some of the issues I've been facing on boards. I'll tell you, more important than the cross-border issue with the board, although sometimes those cultural issues do come into play in the board. Don't get me wrong, they really do. Is making sure that there was alignment amongst the board members, especially amongst the various classes of investments. Because I'm a late stage investor, so I'm usually the BC crossover round, whatever you want to call it. And my economic interests are not always aligned with the A or seed economic interests. And that can often cause a lot of problems at the board level. And all I'd recommend is you deal with it in advance of getting the deal done rather than waiting for the deal to be over and then having the fight at the board. Stop there.
Yeah. That's very true. And those discussions has to be in advance. So, you don't get into the strategy after you go on the board. It has to be in advance. Also, the notion that somebody is representing this group or that group or not that group, once you're a board member, right, you have fiduciary relationship to the entire shareholders, and that's something that, obviously sometimes need to be reminded, but
no, that's an exceedingly important point, by the way. One of the things you should do as entrepreneurs, as you think about who you're going to accept as an investor, is really verify that they can comfortably wear the hat that represents the company and not the fund. Okay. Yes, we have shareholder votes, and when you're voting as a shareholder, you can vote with your fund hat. But when you're voting as a board member, you have to vote with your fiduciary responsibility to the best of the company. Okay. And you need to be comfortable that your investor can do that, because if they can't, there are going to be a lot of issues. And one thing you should do, as much as we do due diligence on you guys, you should do due diligence on us. Okay. And I recommend, for example, that you ask to speak to 1 or 2 CEOs in the portfolio companies of investors that you're going to allow invest in your company, at least, and if not all the investors, at least the people who are going to sit on the boards. You need to speak to the CEOs of their portfolio companies. Okay. Because if you hear that there are issues, you better know it in advance.
Yeah, no, the due diligence, it's a really important point what you said, and it's something that when we sit on if we sit on the side of the company, we sit on both sides, but when we advise companies, we tell them do reverse due diligence. Don't just, make sure you speak to some of the CEO. Make sure that you talk to some people who work as a syndicate with that investor. See how they work, what's their style, how they like, what the people like, what people did not like, and see that it's good for you as well. As far as the terms of the investment, I would say that at least around the world, they more and more consistent. I don't, at least in my experience, they may write it in a little bit different, but the concept of preferred and protective rights to investors and it's at least my experience that they're really done on a global basis, and while they may call the document a bit different, the rights are quite consistent, and the economic terms have been quite consistent in many of the jurisdictions that I've seen investments. Is that your impression as well? Did you see anything significant different?
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Outside of some minor, country-specific things, like, for example, in some European companies, you have to have an employee on the board, right? Outside of something like that, we very much, the terms are the same throughout the world. We're not going to give you new terms just because you're in some country. And we're not going to be softer on our veto rights. We're not going to be softer on our protective rights. They're very important to us. Yep. Okay. Granted, we will try and get the best deal we can get, but we are very comfortable walking away, even after having done a tremendous amount of diligence, even after having signed a term sheet and spent capital, to due diligence with lawyers and financial experts, et cetera. We will walk away if you try and screw with our protective rights, because from experience, they're exceedingly important. By the way, it reminds me of an important topic on this whole thing of like term sheets and things like that. So when VCs ask for part of the term sheet, you will find is that we're going to ask for certain expenses to be reimbursed. Okay, we're not doing that to line our pockets. Let me start out with that. Okay, I'm not saying that some VCs don't play games, but we're really not doing that to line our pockets. So when you see something like $100,000 in expenses, okay, don't have a heart attack. Somewhere between 40 to 70,000 of that is going to the lawyers, depending on where the jurisdiction is and how many lawyers you need, et cetera. 20 to 30,000 of that is going to financial, like E&Y or one of the big four, to come do, finance due diligence. You're probably spending anywhere between $5,000 to $15,000 on IP diligence, okay, and maybe $5,000 or $10,000 on CFIUS. For those of you who are CFIUS, for those of you who aren't familiar with the problem that Gil mentioned, just to very quickly state it, there's now a committee for foreign investment in U.S. companies that basically says if we think that there's some sort of issue from a national security point of view, we can't legally unwind the transaction at any point.
Any point. If you didn't report it, if you didn't do the report, if you decided that this is not this critical technology and you never reported to them and they found out later on, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's scary, but it doesn't matter when or how big or whatever it is. They will just unwind the transaction and people are screwed.
So, you may spend $5,000 or $10,000 getting a CFIUS opinion. So these things add up. That's where the $100,000 is going to. It's not, so I can buy a fancy meal, just so we're clear.
Yeah.
It looks like we have a question here on the side. How many board seats do you typically require with an investment? I think Gil actually had a good summary. So typically, there's going to be a founder or at least the CEO of the company. I think it's important for the CEO of the company to be on the board. I think it's important that there's some sort of chairman of the board. It doesn't have to be an investor. I'm okay with it being, somebody from the company or a founder or something like that.
Or an industry.
I think, right. Well, I was going to say the most important thing to me are industry specialists.
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't really care if you have, usually I would say a minimum is 3 people. I don't think you can really have a board with fewer than 3 people. I think 5 is more normal. It's usually an odd number so that at least on the simple things, you cannot end up with an even number of people, right? You have to vote something. You want to have at least a majority somewhere. So 5 or 7 is very typical. I think the most important thing to do is get industry experts on the board. More important than your VCs. We'll protect our rights, but get industry experts.
Yeah, not true. Normally you will see in a 5, you'll have typically, depends on the stage of the investment, you will have the CEO, you'll have at least 2 VCs, maybe 1 person from the early round, 2 from the later round, and 1 industry or something along those lines. And yeah.
You know, I also see that a lot of startups like to stack their board with their friends, okay, because they think that their friends are going to protect them and vote with them, okay, and it's actually not a good thing to do, okay. Yes, your friends will vote with you, but they're not voting with you for the best of the company. They're voting with you for whatever reason they're voting with you. And what you really want are industry experts who are going to tell you the truth and tell you what's good for the company. So just stacking it with your friends because you think you need to control things is often in the end a mistake for the company.
And also you have to you know, from the get-go, you know, if you look to raise funds and all those things, you want to adhere in a certain way to your investor. And one of the ways to show that you're professional and you're not just there to protect your personal interest, but you're trying to build something bigger, is to show that you're also mature about, you know, how you look at the board, how would you look at the composition. Because at the end of the day, you have to understand that even the investors, whether or not they have more people on the board, they still need the management team to be excellent, and it's their incentive to incentivize the management team and make sure that you know, that they perform to the fullest because they invest in the people at the end of the day in the company.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think we're down to like a minute or two, so we can pick one of the things that we wanted to talk about, or just summarize a couple of things. A little bit about the exit. What do you see now in the market with all those facts and all this stuff that is going on right now, and how does it interplay with, if anything, with this cross-border investments or you know, in general? I'm not sure it's so much cross-border, but it's
I don't know if it's going to make that much of a difference at the moment.
Yeah.
You know, that whole first of all, I'm a big believer in the corporate minimum tax. Okay, I think it's ridiculous that super large companies are getting away with what they're getting away with. So that's the first thing. And I'll tell you, as an American citizen, because I am an American citizen, I still have to pay U.S. taxes. Okay, now thankfully there's a tax treaty, so I don't get double taxed. But you know, no matter, as an American citizen, no matter where you are, you pay U.S. taxes some way or another. So I think it's important for corporations to pay their taxes. Okay, and taxes are not such a big deal for the typical VC company because, you know, you don't have that many revenues yet. Eventually, you will have revenues, God willing, and there'll be big revenues, and then, you know, it'll be an issue. But I'm all for taxes. I'm okay with it.
And the phenomenon now of this SPAC as a special purpose, how do you see those playing right now?
That is going to be interesting. Okay, so I'll tell you, up until a few weeks ago, on the biotech side, again, I'm a therapeutics guy, the biotech window was wide open. Companies were going public and they were trading up 50, 60, 80, 100, 200% in a day, which, by the way, just means they were mispriced. I know the bankers like to say, oh, look how wonderful you did. What they did is leave a lot of money on the table. Leave that aside. You know, and the window shut recently, and then it opened up a little bit. I actually think with Biden getting aducanumab, however you pronounce it, approved, that window is going to go open wide again, because, you know, people are going to be excited by the opportunities. But you don't know when the window opens and closes. So the SPAC is a very interesting vehicle. You know, the issue with SPACs is that the data to date demonstrates so far that your crossover / IPO is typically a little bit of a better return than the SPAC is for investors. Okay. But what I think will be interesting is that my last count, there was something north of 68 healthcare specialty SPACs, okay, that all have to find some acquisition in the next year and a half. Right? That is going to be a really interesting issue for valuation, because what you're going to end up seeing is valuations start to creep up, and it's not clear to me how those SPACs are going to trade in the aftermarket. Okay, so, you know, it is what it is. I'm still a little bit more in favor of the traditional crossover and IPO because of the better aftermarket support. But if you get the right SPAC with the right pipe investors in there, I think it's okay right now. You know, and in the end of the day, what I would say is don't be greedy with your valuation. Okay, because if you're greedy with your SPAC valuation, you think you did yourself a big favor, then you find you don't trade in the aftermarket and the stock just drops.
True. And you're under a lockdown.
Yeah.
All right, I think
Gentlemen,
we're done.
what a great discussion. Thank you so much for being here today. and we will see you soon.
Thank you.
Greg, thank you very much. Gil, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.